Shalom, everyone. It's wonderful to be here.
Shalom.
I'm Rabbi Jaymee Alpert, and I'm really delighted to learn some Torah with you this morning. This morning, we're going to be reading Parashat Bechukotai, which is the last parsha in the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. And it's a really challenging parsha. It begins on page 747 in the Chumash. And this parsha includes a list of blessings and curses. The blessings take up 10 psukim, 10 verses of the parsha, and the curses take up 32 verses. So we can already see a bit of an imbalance. And rather than really dig into a particular blessing or a particular curse, because the blessings are really beautiful and the curses are really, really horrible, and we don't have to read them more often than we need to read them, and we'll hear them in the sanctuary a little bit later. I thought we would take more of a kind of a bird's eye view of these blessings and curses. And I just want to situate ourselves a bit by saying that this is really biblical theology, this whole notion of divine reward and punishment. If we walk in God's ways, if we follow the mitzvot, then we'll be blessed. And if we don't follow the mitzvot, if we don't walk in God's ways, then we will be punished. But this is a pretty uncomfortable theology, I think, for most of us in the 21st century. And already by the rabbinic era, by the Talmud, it wasn't quite as prominent as it was in the Bible. Right, the Torah was very big into divine reward and punishment, sort of the theology of most of the Torah. But theology shifts because we also evolve, God also evolves, right? We can think about when God reveals God's self to Moses at the burning bush, and Moses says, "What's your name?" And God says, "Ahiyah Asher Ahiyah," right? I will be who I will be, right? That evokes movement and evolution. And so I think similarly, theology, how we think of God, shifts and evolves as well. That said, this is our parsha this morning, so we're going to take a look at it. And on the sheet, I have printed the two verses that will sort of be our basis for jumping off. The first is the opening line of the parsha. If you follow my laws and faithfully observe my commandments, following this, we get that list of blessings. Here's what will happen if we're good, right? And then the next verse, Leviticus 26:14, but if you do not obey me and do not observe all these commandments, and this is where that list of curses comes in.
I already have a question.
Great.
I noticed in the first one, the positives, it says kupotai and mipotai. And in the negative, it's only mitzvah.
Yeah. So great question and great noticing, and actually, Rabbi Bach, speaks to that as when he fleshes out what happens with the curses. So yeah, we will probably get there and shed a little light on that, but that was a great thing to pick up on. I thought what we would do, again, just taking the bird's eye view, is start with a text that comes from Yalkut Me'am Loez. It's on page 2, and I'm sorry that the page numbers get printed on your copy, but it's on page 2. It's this long piece, and this is an 18th century commentary on the Tanakh. And what I find really interesting about it is that it was originally written in Judeo-Spanish. And so it was people who had sort of a memory of the Spanish Inquisition and exiles and being moved from country to country. And as I kept that in mind as I was reading this commentary, which is a little bit mystical in nature and also I think quite lovely. So I'm wondering if someone would like to read for us.
If one looks carefully, one will notice that the blessings here begin with the first letter Aleph with the verse, "If you walk in my decrees," and end with the final tav, "I led you forth with your heads held high." Thus, the blessings begin with the Aleph and end with the tav, is the last letter of the alphabet. This teaches that these blessings include all the blessings, both those of the body and those of the soul. This is very much like the entire Torah, which contains the entire alphabet from Aleph to Tav.
Oh, thank you. I'm just going to jump in for a minute. So what I think is so interesting here, and if you can look, and you can look at the text in the Chumash, if you don't trust Yalkut Me'al Moed, right? And you'll see that the list of blessings begins with the letter Aleph, the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet, and it ends with the Tav, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So it's like all inclusive. Okay, let's keep reading.
The punishments, however, begin with the letter Vav, and if you did not listen to me, they conclude with the letter He on Mount Sinai through the hand of Moses. This teaches us that just as between the Vav and the He there is nothing, there is no letter, so the punishments have no substance. Vav He is in reverse alphabetical order.
Right, so the Hebrew alphabet actually goes Hey Vav. And what Yalkut Me'al Moed is saying here is that because the curses begin with the Vav and end with the letter Hey, there's nothing going on here. There's no substance. There is nothing between Vav and Hey. It's the reverse of what happens in the Hebrew alphabet.
He is the fifth letter and Vav is the sixth. This teaches that if we repent, God will reverse the punishments and make them into blessings.
Okay, so let's pause here and I would love your thoughts.
It's very confident.
When you have that much free time, you come up with a lot of stuff.
I look at it. Looks mystical.
That they wrote it, that they of this. It took like one noticed it. And sometimes you do notice it afterwards. I mean, really.
I'm guessing you're not a fan of gematria.
No, I'm not.
Yeah, well, but this, to me, this does feel a little bit mystical in nature. And as I was reading it, I thought, okay, like it's a little bit of a stretch. It feels to me a little bit like gematria, right? Like we can read anything into the text, and at the same time, I think it's really beautiful.
It is, it also feels, let's say, fantastic, because as they're writing this, I mean, over the years, haven't we in more or less experienced the curses? As well as the blessings, but to say the curses are nothing, maybe they mean something else when they say that.
Maybe Yalkut Me'al Moed means something else, or maybe.
I mean, if they're saying they're insubstantial or whatever the word was, because honestly, my apologies, I was pouring coffee while he was reading.
No substance.
No substance. What could they mean by that if, in fact, substantively, the Jewish people have experienced what seem like the curses?
I think that's a really good question.
I don't have an answer, but
Well, I mean, I would turn it back around to the group and say, well, what do you think that means? But,
maybe it means they're not permanent.
I would say what it means is that we have a God that is a retributive God. There's retribution if we don't comply with the commandments, with the covenant. If we, if we flout it, if we forget it, if we lose it, there'll be retribution. And that's why the curses are disproportionately more than the blessings, because the message here is fear God, and that's a good thing, because I mean, in the end, that will mean that the Jewish people come around, that it's better to take those warnings and heed those warnings if you can. Now, and as David just said, there's plenty of evidence of us falling and stumbling along the way, but in the end, and at the end of these curses, there's a positive. Because it says that no matter what, even if we fail, that I will still take care of you. I will never let you go as my people. Right? I mean, this is at the end of the
Yes, and actually that
God, right?
line has become part of our Yom Kippur liturgy, right? That God will
Right,
remember the covenant with
Right,
Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham.
right. But the
but-
question is, what is the meaning of the retributive
But I
God?
would say what you are suggesting and what you're saying is very much in line with this biblical theology of divine reward and punishment. I would say for most people today, that's a pretty tough theology because we've all lived through the bad things happening to good people. It doesn't always work so neatly, this divine reward and punishment. We can do our absolute best and still have pretty terrible things befall us. Right? So I would suggest that this ancient type of theology, the theology that's so prominent in the Torah, was really befitting of a nascent nation and people trying to figure out their way and people trying to figure out this new covenant with God. Right. And there is some of that, like, well, if you don't do this, right, because there had to be a way to keep the people together and to forge that relationship. I think for us today in the modern era, this type of thinking is not really, so I will speak for me. It is not comfortable for me. This is not my theology, even though terrible things have befallen the Jewish people over the course of the millennia, right? And we don't have to look anywhere in our history. We are experiencing it now, right? But for me, that is not a sign of divine punishment.
Psychologically, it's like for, like with a very young child, if things have to be much more cut and dry because you're trying to teach the child cause and effect. And then as the child or the people develop, they understand the world more abstractly and things don't always line up so neatly.
Thank you for saying this. And I would say that the tochacha, this list of curses that comes in this parsha, is really in the children of Israel's, if not infancy, I would say they're toddlers at this point, right? It was pretty close to Sinai.
Oh, they're toddlers.
I was gonna say, it sounds very folkloric. Like they're trying to explain things that are happening in a way that people can easily grab onto. And one of the, I don't really know how things were taught back then, but like people know their alphabet. And when you explain it in simple terms, it makes it easier for more people to understand. And they're kind of, like most folklore stories, they're trying to impart some sort of message with a story, and they're using the letter combination as the vessel for the story, which is just, if you do good, God will forgive you and things will be better. Just, hang in there kind of thing.
You're really combining Torah with this commentary in a beautiful way, right? So there's the message from the Torah itself. If you do this, good things will happen. If you don't do this, bad things will happen. And then the Alpert Me'am Loev, many centuries later, using this easy to understand metaphor.
Well, and I would maybe make an argument, because I remember being forced to read, okay, I loved The Great Gatsby, but other books along those lines. I hated Animal Farm. But like in high school, when you're taught to read all of these things and then you have to relate them to something and find the deeper meaning, and I got to a point where I was like, why can't this thing just be this thing? So to go back and say like, well, they probably didn't write that like, with the vav and the hey and everything. This reminds me very much of saying, well, maybe it's just what it is, but maybe also like, some of those things probably are just what they are. But then sometimes you read something and you're like, oh, that must have meant that because the author was thinking. So when it was written, maybe this is stretching it a little bit far, but maybe there was some sort of thought into a little bit deeper meaning and not just what it says on the surface. So like, I wouldn't go so far as to be mystical about it and necessarily go as far to say the vav and the hey and all of that, but the intention that they're pulling out, I think is probably in the right direction. I think they're getting a little nitpicky, but I also thought my high school teachers were getting a little nitpicky, honestly, like. So I'm like, it really doesn't. I think it's, so I think that's what's happening there. I think it's a high school teacher trying to nitpick and like pull out every little thing to make a point about the text.
And to derive meaning from it.
Yeah.
Right, and you know, y'all quote me on the way, this is the 18th century. It was thousands of years after the Torah kind of got compiled, and certainly thousands of years after it was passed down as oral Torah, right? So we have a very long history of trying to find meaning in the text. So you buy it or not, I am not offended. I just thought it was a really kind of interesting way to look at it.
The 18th century is also a time when things are glimmering better, which might be an interesting context for it, depending at least what part of the 18th century. And I was going to pick up on this idea of, you know, children and toddlers versus adolescents versus adults or what have you. I think we can sometimes run the risk of therefore trying to make ourselves feel like we're somehow better than our forebears or more evolved, which if we are, it's barely. And I would argue probably since evolution takes a very long time, probably hardly not at all. But we could look at it a different way, which is to say experience. I think this is one of the things that adults are often trying to convince kids of. We have experience, so you don't necessarily have to repeat this mistake. And they're like, well, yes, I do, because fooey on your experience, so to speak. But I would, maybe that's a way of contextualizing this, which is to say, are people having experienced the curses, if you will, but also the blessings, may have a sense that the curses don't have to be permanent, but they're also more concrete than they might have been to the people to whom they were expressed. And when they had to stand later on the two mountains and say them out loud, at that point, they haven't experienced anything except the most immediate redemption. They may or may not remember slavery. In fact, by the time they get to the Jordan River, that generation's died off anyway, so now that's history. So
the other tohacha.
well, yeah, but it's related. So or restated. So maybe part of the difference or part of the point is that when you're told a bunch of things in words that haven't happened yet, that's not as meaningful as you've experienced things for whatever reason over a few thousand years. So we're in a different place than they were.
I'm looking at the Bavhe more simplistically. It's contrived, just like Gematria. And we sing our prayers and we teach children the prayers and sing the songs so we can remember. So the message, to me, these are just methods of remembering and passing it on. It just, the message is important, but the way you do it, many ways.
Okay, that's a great point, and similar to using this kind of folklore mentality, people know the alphabet. I still think it's interesting that this commentator is making meaning of the fact that the letters are reversed, and they were doing a very close read of the text. I'm not sure that my mind would have picked up on that and come up with this meaning, but I mean, that's the beauty of studying commentary. And again, you can take it or leave it. I just thought it was an interesting approach to this text, so.
Nelson.
It seems to me the context might be the Christian world, where torment was eternal. And the 18th century, the 17th century paintings of eternal torment and hell, and it's just a horrible place, and you're roasted on fire and what have you. He's saying, no, the pain is over. we're not going to be roasted eternally. Maybe the Jewish people will continue to suffer, but we're not going to be roasted eternally. It's a different conception of punishment.
Yeah, thank you for that. And again, I think your comment is connected to what was said earlier, in terms of even at the end of the Tochacha, these horrible, horrible verses. God says, I will remember you.
Right.
I will keep my covenant.
It's worth looking at this last verse at 44, verse 44 on page 752. You know, yeah, even then, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or spurn them so as to destroy them, annulling my covenant with them. For I, the Lord, am their God. I will remember in their favor the covenant with the ancients whom I freed from the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations to be their God, I, the Lord. I mean, this is tremendous consolation within, at the end of the curses. And just think about how our ancestors, you know, that were familiar with the Torah would cling to this statement at the end to give them hope.
Yes,
This is the ultimate declaration of hope.
yes, yes, it is. Right. It also, I believe, encourages tshuva. Right, that there's always an opportunity to return, to come back, to change our ways. Right, I think that's embedded in the parsha and in the psukim that you just pointed out, and I think it's also in the Yalkut Me'amah ways.
One of the interesting things that I noticed is that these seem to be rewards on earth in the here and now, as opposed to there will be hell later and we'll all be living in a Hieronymus Bosch picture with eternal torment. No, it's like it's here and it's temporary and it's changeable and it can be more fluid.
So that's also very much sort of Torah theology, that it is the here and now, that it is this life on earth. And I think that through line has carried with us, that's sort of the Jewish approach to life, right? We believe, or mainstream Judaism believes in Olam Haba, in the world to come, but really this world is our only guarantee. So let's make it count. And this notion of Olam Haba, this world, the world to come, it's sort of in the Tanakh, not in the Torah, but in the prophets a little bit, in the books of the writings a little bit. There's like a hint, right? That theology really gets developed in the rabbinic era for the Talmudic rabbis who endured tremendous suffering during their lifetime and in their recent history. And their theology begins to include Olam Haba. Well, we are good people right now. We are doing what is right. We are abiding by God's mitzvot, and we are suffering. Maybe this will get resolved in the world to come. Right? But Judaism is really focused on the here and now, even with that rabbinic belief that's been with us now for 2,000 years about Olam Haba. We still focus on this world. And that's a huge difference between Judaism and many other world religions.
Right. And, you know, the truth is 2,000 years and then the state of Israel. I mean, it was, came to fruition again. We lost the land, we lost, the language in a sense, okay? There wasn't a common culture anymore. We were dispersed. Yet and the question became, are we still a nation? During that time, are we still a nation? And these kinds of passages confirm that we were. It was.
I would also say that being here still today, talking about this,
exactly
also
right.
We didn't lose our sense of peoplehood
right.
for all those years.
The covenant, the Sinai covenant is what kept us together.
Keeps us together.
We appear to be the only people in the history of the world who have been denied their land for as long as almost 2,000 years and somehow still survived. So thank God on the one hand, and I think that again refers to, Ivan is kind of setting the context again. And I think that maybe is how we have to try to understand how they can say not substantial by reading two letters that happen to be reversed. And I think the rabbis do this a lot. So I mean, they're, everybody since the Talmud is basically building on that kind of Talmudic tradition of you read something and it's in the Torah, but it's not where we are, shall we say? So what could it possibly mean now?
I love that. I want to hold on to that thread and finish at least this text. Rabbi Ruth and Loria did tell me that this group really likes to engage, so I'm delighted to bear witness to that. I'd love to finish this text, and again, you don't have to buy it. It's okay if it feels a little high school teacher or too mystical. I do think there's beauty in it, and then I'd like to come back to this whole notion of how we understand and re-understand and reinterpret, because that's also in our parsha this morning. And I'm sorry, but we might not get to Bach, yeah, but it's in the sheet and you can read it. All right, so let's finish this text, right? The Vav and the Hey is in reverse alphabetical order. Hey is the fifth letter and Vav is the sixth. This teaches that if we repent, God will reverse the punishments and make them into blessings. And that's based on an older text by Yekra Rabbah. And I do love this because to me, this is like, it's a very Jewish notion, right? We can always do tshuva. There's always room for tshuva. There's always room to change our ways, to try to do better. Right? We say that, I mean, it's not even Shavuot, but I'm already thinking about Rosh Hashanah, right? And so 2 seasons of the year, Pesach for Rosh Hashanah and then Simchat Torah, Pesach. So to me, it feels cogent and in line with so much of Jewish belief and practice. But let's finish the text. So if someone else would like to read where it says the blessings begin, 2 paragraphs up from the bottom.
I'll read. The blessings begin with Aleph and end with Tav for another reason. If we are good and keep the commandments from Aleph to Tav, from A to Z, we will be worthy of all these blessings. If not, we will not be worthy. Similarly, the punishments begin with a Vav and conclude with the Hey. This teaches that if we sin, we will be in exile and the divine presence will be in exile. This is alluded to in the letters Vav Hey, which is the second half of the Tetragrammaton.
Thank you. So again, this is very much in line with the biblical theology of divine reward and punishment. If we do God's will, we'll be rewarded. If we sin, we'll be punished. Right? So again, that's not such a comfortable theology. And even for the Talmudic rabbis, that wasn't such a comfortable theology. So it's not just us in the 21st century. But I do like this concluding passage that says, when we're in exile, the divine presence will be in exile too. And this is based on a much older belief. This again is Talmudic, that when the children of Israel are sent into exile, and we can think about it as physically without our homeland, we can think about it spiritually, like we're not really connecting with God, right? Then the Shekhinah, God's presence, accompanies the children of Israel. So on the one hand, we can see that as punishment, oh, we're in exile. And on the other hand, we can see it connecting back to this whole, I will remember the covenant pasuk that says, even when we're in exile, and again, we can understand this physically, not in the land of Israel, spiritually, somehow disconnected from God, the Shekhinah will accompany us. So we're never alone. And to me, that is really powerful and really, really comforting.
Brings one to tears. It really does, if you think about it, because it's, I don't know any other concept that, we debase ourselves, if you will, the biblical theology would say, and we bring that around to God isn't happy about that and comes with us,
Yeah,
so we can suffer together. That's brings you to tears.
it's really moving. Yeah, it's really moving that even in our pain and suffering, and each of us kind of understand that for ourselves, what that means, God is still accompanying us through that pain and suffering.
But then you're saying that God is not all powerful.
Well, that is a timeless question.
Unless we're saying that God is so all powerful that God experiences our pain with us.
Because God gave us the right to choose, so our actions here, you know, God can only really intervene so much ultimately if we have free will. So God can experience our suffering, but because we are human and earthly beings, and have the free will, he can't change what our actions are on earth, but he can be there with us.
If I like to, nobody likes this, I bring it up every now and then, so I'll bring it up one more time, which is if I like to think of it as that God has is outside of time, if you will, so every possibility, God is aware of every possibility, and every choice we make is one more different possibility. So God is there for all of that. And I'm not saying it's parallel worlds or whatever, maybe it is, however you want to think of it. I'm just saying that, picking up on what you said, everybody makes choices and God is there with every choice. And maybe we might have made different choices, or maybe we make different choices in the future, or all the choices exist somehow at the same time, even though we don't appreciate that. But God does. Okay, it was another lead balloon like every other time I've thrown that out.
Actually falls, what we will read on Shavuot, right, with God revealing God's self to the children of Israel at Sinai. And there's this really wonderful midrash about God speaking to everyone in a language that only they can understand at the same simultaneously. So that everybody heard God's voice, how they understand that, God's voice in a way that they could perceive. And that God is so powerful that God was able to speak to everyone individually all at the same time. So I actually hear a lot of that midrash and what you're proposing. That the choices exist, but we might only be able to tap into one at a time, or two, and then we make our choice, right?
But what is the source of that midrash? Because maybe I should look it up.
You know what, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I can get it to you.
Okay.
After Shabbat.
I'm seeing this more from a historical perspective. Maybe because of the time that it was, because we were in exile. I'm thinking this kind of theology of God being with us developed, because otherwise, what would have kept us together and hope? Because I'm thinking, and the gang knows I'm very much into historical context. All the other empires, especially the ones that are based perhaps around a central religion or something, as soon as they lost their centrality, their main temple, as it were, or whatever, they felt that and perhaps the other empires also impose it upon them that your God has failed you because we were able to conquer you. And so those, the Assyrians, everybody else, they kind of dispersed and didn't happen. We were dispersed, but the theology was always that God is still with you no matter where you are. And it doesn't depend upon the base of Mikdash or the land. It's internally within you.
Yes.
And so if we didn't have that hope, God is with us, then I think we wouldn't have survived as other people have not survived.
Agree with you. I think that's actually part of the brilliance of the Talmudic rabbis, right? That in the year 70, this whole experiment could have gone out the window. They could have said, we no longer have our central place of worship. We cannot offer our sacrifices. We cannot make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. We cannot do all the things. Well, we can't do the whole book of Leviticus, right? There are lots of things that had to change, but the brilliance of the Talmudic rabbis in that moment was to say, wait a minute, there's still a there. How can we keep the core of who we are and find new ways to be Jewish, right? And to still worship and to still have God be present with us, right? And I really can't say enough about how incredible their minds must have been and how not evolutionary, but revolutionary they were to be able to say, okay, so we can't make sacrifice. So there's no job for the priests anymore. We can't make sacrifices in the temple. We can't even be in Jerusalem. We can't do this and we can't do that, but we can pray and we can study and we can establish smaller communities and we can still observe Shabbat. And that's incredible. It's incredible.
Picking up, I think, on what Larry was saying, because I want to make sure I understand the point. A big difference that you're alluding to also, Rabbi, is that we don't say, our God was defeated, our God's a no God, we're going to take on their God. We say, pretty typically, we did something, it was wrong, we're paying for it with exile. God owns the whole world, the whole universe. There's only one God. So our God isn't defeated. We're experiencing something.
Right.
The place where I would push back, because it's just not in line with my theology, but if that works for you.
Go ahead,
sure.
push back.
My
We can learn
pushback
from each other.
would be, to me, exile happened for a whole host of reasons, not necessarily. And I know there are lots of midrashim and their stories and Talmudic stories that would say contrary. I personally would say, I don't know that we're in exile. We have been in exile because we didn't walk in God's ways. I would say history happened. There were wars, right?
I wouldn't disagree with you, and that wasn't really my point.
Okay.
My point was that what allows rabbinic Judaism to flourish in some sense, even though we are in exile, or, we don't have the temple, we don't have the land, now we have the land, but not the temple. Some people would say that's terrible and we still need Mashiach to come to reestablish it anytime. But there were 3 white hairs on that red heifer, so. But because honestly, I think that's what they really mean. Because what if we really did try to, well, that's another subject. The point I'm really trying to, where I think I'm trying to agree with you in a long-winded way, my apologies, is that the genius of it is, however you want to frame it, and I think they're framing it that way because it's actually consistent with the Torah. So it's, you can have a revolution, but pin it to something that doesn't seem as revolutionary and maybe more people come along.
Yeah.
I think that's the genius of it, because what they're saying, whatever reason they're pinning on it, is that we have a way of continuing because our particular universal God doesn't rely on the temple still being in existence. And what's more, some aspect of God can come with us in our suffering.
And another thing, picking up on what Larry said, one of the challenges became, how do you, the whole idea that we were rejected because we lost the land and God spurned us and cursed us and so forth, that the Christians picked up on that. Okay. And so it became the Old Testament, it's called replacement theology, right? That the Christians view became the legitimate view. It took over that, was Abraham instead of, Abraham, we were still Abraham's children physically, but spiritually, it now changed to a Christian context, Christ and so forth. But that was all we overcame that. In the modern age, the recent popes, including this Pope Francis, has agreed that, that was all wrong because of certain things that Jews wrote. They convinced these popes that this whole history was wrong, that this persecution was unjust. And they agree, and they acknowledge that the Jews are still, the history and the theology is valid, and they apologized. An amazing turn of events.
It is. So I feel like we could spend so much time continuing to discuss this. I do want to point something out. And again, this was an earlier thread of ancient, modern, and evolution and revolution. And we are out of time. So I'll just ask for another 2 minutes. Another. I was told. 45.
We do it on shul time, so we're always 15 minutes later than that.
Well, you're 9:45, that's 9:45 PM.
This group would make for a very robust Leil Shavuot. So and again, there are other texts in here which you're welcome to look at your own leisure. This Rabbi Nubachia piece explains the kind of levels of sins and getting deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And there is a more succinct note in Chumash Ephraim, which might answer your question as well on page 748. You want to take a look. But I'm very taken. There's a note in our Chumash on page 747. It's number 3 down below. And this sort of also is my own platform these days, and it connects the physical to the spiritual. So I just wanted to take a moment to talk
Rabbi,
about
what verse is that?
So it is a commentary on chapter 26, verse 3. And the note is down below the line on page 747, verse 3, where it says, if you follow my laws. So if you follow my laws, some commentators have understood this as laws that I follow myself, meaning God, God's self. The verb translated follow literally means walk or go. So this in the Hebrew, it's im bechukotai telechu, if you walk according to my rules, right? Prompting the comment that humans walk in God's ways, but angels stand in God's presence. Human beings, unlike angels, have the ability to grow and change after doing something wrong. Jewish law is known as halacha and is sometimes understood as the way to go. Now, what I think is so interesting is that halacha means the path or the way, right? It's Jewish law, but it's also Jewish custom. It's also how we kind of live Jewishly, right? But there's a movement associated with halacha. Halacha means walk. It's derived from lalechet, walk in God's ways. Halacha is an evolution, right? It's not one and done. We don't observe biblically all these laws, right? We observe them rabbinically and all of the evolution that has come after the Talmudic laws, right? And there's still bodies of law being evolved and developed now, even as we speak, right? In the conservative movement, it's the Committee on Jewish Law. I don't know, yeah. Put that in there, right? But to me, that's a remarkable thing, right? And it's not coming out of nowhere. It's embedded in the language that we use, right? That there is room for human interpretation and there is room for evolution. And we have it in our history, certainly with the Talmud, right? That is the time. But then in the 2 millennia since the Talmud, right? We're still evolving. And I think in addition to the hope that God will be with us.
It goes back further than that to the daughters.
I would agree.
That's where it starts. Yeah.
Right? This room for, hadn't thought of that. We can do it differently.
And consistent with that, we still do it in the style of Shalot and Shvot. There has to be a question that one is trying to answer. It isn't just we're going to start ruling on high.
What is the context for the question? how can we answer it in a way that makes sense? I think that too, you know, when all rabbis were responsible for She'alot, and she wrote a couple of centuries ago, and there are documented cases of rabbis ruling slightly differently on somebody's chicken about whether or not it was kosher, depending on whether or not the person could afford a new chicken.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Right? It has to be halacha with compassion and understanding.
Relevance to each generation. Every generation has to make it relevant, has to see, and we're the latest generation, we're the current generation, and there are people like Jonathan Sachs that can look at the whole history of the Torah and shed new light on it and make it feel like, it's ours, that it makes sense, that there's reason and logic to it.
Yes.
This is fascinating what you said about that we walk and we don't stand. And it's tradition that if you really want to have, say, an Orthodox rabbi, if it's really a halakha problem, you don't just ask him, you have to go to him. When they see you in person, you're suddenly a human being. If you just ask the question like the angels, you're standing back, then you're not as involved and you're more likely to get a negative answer. Like the chicken, you have to actually bring the chicken.
You have to bring the chicken.
But in the case of even divorce, I mean, there was an issue, my husband had an issue with a get and or a conversion, I don't know, it was something that they were making them, and then when they went, my husband, well, the other, I think it was an Orthodox rabbi involved, who happened to be a friend, he said, go visit Rabbi Feinstein. And when he went to Feinstein, he was much more liberal than what he had told him, on the phone or in writing. So, I mean.
Because we're human, right? It's about human connection. And
Even
even
you say walk and
Yeah.
stand.
gotta go, which, by the way, I mean, it's not a secret, right? I'm here, not only to engage in this tremendous conversation about Torah, but also to talk about the connection between the physical and the spiritual. And I think these are such beautiful examples of what that means and how it's embedded in our language ourselves. We usually, when we talk about halacha, we usually just think about Jewish law, but I think there's something about that language of movement, of walking, of going, right? That should teach us something about the nature of halacha as well, that it's not once and that's it. There's the ability for it to evolve just as we evolve.
I always, this might not be exact, but I always take halacha is, it's not the law, it's the way to live your life.
That's beautiful.
What?
It's the way to live your life.
And
So
it's not-
it encompasses everything you do.
Yeah.
Whether you think there's a law involved or not.
And it's not only halakha, but it's agadah, right? It's stories. It's it's not only the law is created through narratives that we
Yes.
read, the stories that, are part of our tradition. And, and one feeds on the other, from the experiences, from the stories, we get the laws. And from the laws, we find ways to, to make it more solid, more, to put fences around, etc.
And to build a practice that keeps us together as a people, or at least hold on to the core of what we get from Torah. Thank you very much for this rich discussion. I had a number of plans and backup plans, and we went in a different direction. So thank you. Thank you for engaging. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't.